I know you're all really at the end of your day and ready to move on to the wine and cheese. And I appreciate your sticking around for just a couple of minutes. I'm deeply honored to be able to say just a few words in memory of Don Wonderly, who died at the age of 93 on September 17th of this year. Tom Fagan, who is a two-time NASP president, former editor of the NASP Communique, current NASP historian, and Don's first doctoral student at Kent State, wrote a memorial article that's going to appear in the Ohio School Psychologists that I hope you'll all read. As Tom's tribute describes it, Don's career was long, varied, and colorful. He was a professional musician. He was a family services caseworker, a classroom teacher, school psychologist, student services administrator, private practitioner, and as many of us knew him, university professor. Don was a pioneering member of OSPA, hailing back to the glory days when conferences were not the subdued professional events that they are now, but rather raucous parties that went on well into the night at Atwood Lake Lodge. And back in those days, the entire membership of OSPA kicked in a grand total of $1 to pay his salary as OSPA's first executive secretary. To Tom's inspiring and touching tribute that will appear in TOSP, I want to add just a couple of personal reflections. I thought it was strange when the first encounter I ever had with Don involved racing to keep up with him as he ran through the student center at Kent State. I thought I was there to be interviewed for admission to the school psychology program, but the experience I had that day and many others since then cemented my perspective of Don as somebody who was always late for an engagement, who was always preoccupied with something other than the immediate business at hand, and who was always on his way to launch yet one more challenge to the status quo. Don was often a dinner guest in my home, and those events were seasoned with lively and often contentious debates that he would deliberately instigate, but not until dinner was over and his drink had been refilled. Don's signature interaction with me was to challenge my feminist views, and I always fought back as he knew I would. In later years, when we worked together, he taunted me by turning up the volume in his office so I would be forced to listen to Rush Limbaugh rail against the policies of tree huggers, liberals, and feminists. Of course, Don did have the last laugh when he finally published his book in 1991, in which he included me in his acknowledgments. But what he wrote was, Dr. Kathleen McNamara was perhaps our conscience, pointing out the need for recognizing the unique contributions of females in every professional field, while preparing endless examples of gourmet cuisine that belied her feminist leanings. Alex Thomas has reminded us that education is what's left when you've forgotten everything that you learned, and I can't think of anyone who educated me to the extent that Don did. Two lessons have remained clear to me as a result of that education. The first is to always ask, so what? I recall having written what I thought was an eloquent first chapter to my dissertation, explaining how the existing body of research was related to my dissertation topic. To my dismay, Don responded with the starkly dismissive comment that he wrote across the front of it, so what? He had little patience for the dry, dispassionate approach that's so characteristic of the research that we read in journals. He snorted literally at those of his students who defended the points they were making in class by simply citing somebody else's research findings. He always demanded to know, first of all, why an idea was important, why it was important enough to spend time defending. And to answer that, he proposed his second idea, which was always to get in the bathtub and think about it. Now, I don't have any doubt that his bathroom, which, by the way, I never saw, but I don't have any doubt that his bathroom was an intellectual sanctuary of sorts, stocked with books and papers, and I quickly learned that a coffee stain imprinted on any of my written work was a sign that he had given it careful and deep review. So while I personally never found the bathtub to be a location conducive to deep thinking, I have noticed over the years that the ideas that I have eventually given up and left behind in my own thinking are the ones that I never thought through as deeply and as critically as Don would have expected me to. I was a student of his in the late 70s and the early 80s when, at that time, the recently adopted Public Law 94-142, now known as IDEA, dominated the playing field for school psychologists, focusing attention on multi-factored evaluations, writing reports, special education eligibility, etc. So Don liked to say that, and he said it often, that a monkey could be trained to give IQ tests. One of his trademark assertions that sent his colleagues into a tailspin of outrage. Many don't know that the company he founded with several of his former students, PSI Associates, was created specifically to offer schools an alternative approach to school psychological services, one that was based on a model of prevention that also formed the basis for a federal training grant to Kent State University back in the 60s and 70s. PSI stood for Prevention Systems Intervention, and some of you might recognize that as the same principle behind the tiered approach of today's RTI model. I don't use the term genius lightly, but that is what Don Wunderlich was. Looking back at my career, I see his influence at every step along the way, a point on which my own students, who just last week spent an entire class period on the so what question, would have to agree. The world is a far less interesting place now without his insight and wit, and I'm grateful to have been a student of both. Thank you. And I believe I get to tell you that it's wine and cheese time. So thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.